I once sat in the back of a wood-paneled seminar room watching a man explain Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. He was leaned forward, hands carving slow, deliberate shapes in the air, his voice dropping into a reverent, hushed tone every time he spoke of the unfolding of Geist. The students around him were perfectly still, wearing that specific expression of pained concentration people use to signal they're definitely, absolutely following along. He looked like a man who had climbed a mountain and seen the face of God, or at least a very sophisticated architectural rendering of him. And then a woman in the front row asked a question. It wasn't a long question. It didn't contain any Greek or German. She just said, "Is he just saying that we change our minds when we learn new things?" The man's hands froze mid-air. The room went cold. He didn't answer her. Instead, he gave her this small, pitying smile, the kind you give a child who's asked why the moon follows the car, and told her she clearly hadn't submitted to the labor of the notion enough to understand the response. In that moment, the deep-down satisfaction he took in the complexity was obvious. It wasn't about the truth. It was about the wall. It reminded me of a description I read once, that Hegel is essentially a tailor wearing an incredibly expensive coat made entirely of fog. We have been conditioned to believe that if a sentence is long and the vocabulary is impenetrable, it must be profound. We've reached a point where we treat confusion as a sign of intellectual status and clarity as a sign of a simple mind. This is the Hegel sickness, the belief that if you can just change the language, you can change the world. It's why we say unhoused instead of homeless, as if the softer syllable provides a blanket for the person sleeping on the concrete. But the truth is simpler and much more dangerous to the ego. If you can't explain it to a child, you don't actually know it, you're just performing.
That is such a perfect way to put it. That performance.
Yeah.
The use of complexity as a shield or a wall.
Right.
Or just a way to feel important.
Exactly. An intellectual status marker.
Right. And it's not about actually discovering anything. And I think it's so important to recognize that this isn't just about, making fun of dense academic text. It's about seeing that wall when it's put up in front of us.
And when we put it up ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. We all do it. And this tension, this struggle between these really complex, systematic ways of thinking and the, frankly, urgent need for just clarity.
Yeah.
For something that actually changes things on the ground.
Yeah.
This has been the engine of critique in philosophy for, 200 years?
A long time.
A very long time. So our deep dive today is really a journey into that critique. Our mission is to unpack where this systematic thought came from, why people started pushing back, and how that evolved into, a modern critique of academic jargon as a kind of social weapon.
And then hopefully find a way out. To look for a language that actually does something that's transformative instead of just, renaming the problem.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start at the source, or at least the name most associated with the sickness, Hegel. He builds this incredible, just monumental system of philosophy and history, but it's all balanced on one single, really bold assumption about time itself. What is that core idea?
The foundational premise, the thing you have to buy into, is the belief in reason inherent to history. That's the whole game.
Okay, what does that mean in simple terms?
It means that for Hegel, history isn't just one damn thing after another. It's not chaos. It's a rational process. It has a logic. And because it has a logic, philosophy can do more than just record what happened.
It can understand why it happened?
Precisely. It can grasp the necessity, the logical steps within the historical facts. And this is what makes philosophy of history different from what, say, a regular historian does, who might just be cataloging dates and names. Philosophy claims it can see the underlying engine of it all, this movement of spirit or Geist.
So if history is rational, if it has a logic, that means you can deduce its purpose, its necessity. But that must mean some things get left out, right? If it has to be rational and progressive, what about the stuff that's just chaotic or repetitive?
He draws some very, very sharp lines. And he excludes two huge domains right off the bat. The first is nature.
The natural world.
The entire natural world.
Yeah.
It's deemed irrelevant to this grand historical story because for him, it doesn't have any real, vertical development. It's just a perpetually self-repeating cycle.
Birth, death, repeat.
Birth, death, repeat.
Oh.
He even quotes the Bible, nothing new under the sun. Nature just reproduces its forms. It's cyclical, not directional. So it's out.
Okay, so nature's out. What's the second big exclusion?
The second is what he calls prehistory. And this is a bit tricky. It's not just the time before writing. For Hegel, it's the whole realm of, as he puts it, loose and wild social groups that haven't formed a proper constitutionalized state.
So if you don't have a government and a constitution, you're not in the game.
You're not in the game. And if you don't have what he calls subjective history, written records where you articulate your own self-understanding, you're basically in a historical void. He has no time for any romantic ideas about, a golden age or anything like that. He's basically saying if you don't have a rational political structure and you can't write your own story, you haven't entered history yet.
That is an incredibly high bar. So it's not enough just to exist in time. You have to exist in a way that shows this rational progress. So what's left? What is the only thing that really counts as history for him?
The only thing that really matters for this kind of history belongs to what he calls the realm of objective spirit.
Objective spirit.
Yeah. This is the space where humanity manages to crawl out of its purely natural state, just self-interest survival, and becomes truly spirit. It's where we achieve a real capacity for change, and that for the better.
The impulsive perfectibility.
That's the key phrase. To be historically relevant, you have to be part of a state, a structure that lets you pursue your own goals while also recognizing that other people are free and have their own goals. So yeah, not everything that happened in the past actually has a past that matters to philosophy.
Which is a huge, huge claim. And this is the intellectual mountain that Kierkegaard, his pseudonym Climacus, decides he has to tear down. What I find so interesting is that he starts by basically agreeing with Hegel's definition. How does he use that agreement as a setup?
It's a brilliant move. He's very shrewd. Climacus basically says, okay, I see your terms. He agrees that history, this grand world historical project you're talking about, would have to be about free, rational, moral agents making choices.
Not just things happening like a rock rolling down a hill.
Exactly. And he agrees that, if you're going to do that kind of history, it would have to be about this objective spirit, about kingdoms and empires. He even sort of mocks it, mentioning China and Persia, almost as if to say, sure, if that's the kind of boring, massive scale story you want to tell, go right ahead.
But that agreement is a trap. He takes that shared definition of this grand objective system and uses it as the very reason why a normal person, a finite, subjective individual, should just refuse to play. How does he make that jump?
The jump is the moral argument. Climacus insists that you must not abstract from the reality and interest of being a finite subject. Hegel's whole system requires you to zoom out so far that the individual's choice, their suffering, their moment of decision all just blur into a grand necessary pattern.
It all just becomes a data point for the unfolding of Geist.
Right. And Climacus says that is morally bankrupt. If you only focus on the big rational movements of kingdoms, you lose the entire reason we care about anything in the first place. Subjective moral action, individual existence, the one singular life you're actually living is the only thing that really matters.
And his big weapon to protect that singular life is this radical idea of contingency. He has to deny that there's some accessible reason baked into history. Why is that denial so critical for him?
It's to avoid what you could call the contingency trap. It's the philosophical fatalism that just flows directly from Hegel's system. If you assume reason is just in history, then every single thing that happened in the past had to happen that way. It was necessary.
To get us to where we are now.
Right. But here's the trap. If that determination works one way, from the past to the present, it has to work the other way too. If the past was necessary, then you can logically figure out the future from the past.
Which means necessity leads to prediction, and prediction erases free will.
Exactly. If the grand march of history is all predetermined, then the moral choice you make right now, in this moment, it's an illusion. You were just a little cog turning in a big machine, moving toward an outcome that was already decided. Climacus fights this with everything he has, arguing for radical contingency.
Meaning nothing had to happen.
Nothing had to happen the way it did. And because of that, nothing about the future is set in stone. And that, in turn, restores the absolute weight and freedom and terror to every single choice you make.
This is where you can really see the theological engine behind his philosophy, which then blows up into this much bigger argument. He's really trying to protect one very specific, very improbable event from being swallowed by Hegel's system.
Oh, absolutely. The singular event he's building this whole fortress around is the incarnation.
Yeah.
God becoming a man in Christ. I mean, by definition, that is the most improbable thing imaginable, the ultimate paradox.
If he can't be a necessary step in a logical plan.
If it is, it loses all its power. If Hegel's system can just absorb that event and make it a rational, necessary part of the unfolding of Geist, then everything is meaningless. All singular actions, all miracles, anything truly new, it's all just part of the program. So by fighting the system that would make the incarnation necessary, Climacus ends up creating this profound defense, not just of faith, but of human freedom itself, against this suffocating logic of a predictive, systematic history.
He's saying the system is neat and tidy, but it makes real life, with all its messy choices, impossible. It's really the first great counterattack on the Hegel sickness.
Yeah, the idea that a system that explains everything actually ends up explaining nothing that matters to a real living person.
But that critique, the idea that the system is too abstract, it evolves. If Kierkegaard saw the system as cold and inhuman, Nietzsche saw the entire history of Western thought as something way worse. A kind of terminal illness.
Yeah, history of exhaustion, of meaninglessness. He argues that our entire philosophical tradition has been manufacturing its own disease, and he gives it a name: nihilism.
We throw that word around a lot today. What did Nietzsche mean by it? For him, it's not just, being a moody teenager. It's a deep historical diagnosis.
Right. For Nietzsche, nihilism is, at its root, the negation of life and the interest of security and peace. It's when the instinct to just survive trumps the instinct to truly live, to affirm, to grow, to embrace the chaos. He looks at all of European history, especially Christian morality and the search for absolute truth, and sees it as this long, slow process of saying no to life. We invented all these values: truth, goodness, God, and their fundamental purpose was to devalue the messy, wild, unpredictable, and frankly terrifying parts of real existence. We chose stability over intensity, safety over life.
And he sees this playing out in two historical stages, which ends in a huge crisis.
Yes. The first stage is that long historical period where our survival instinct makes us create rules and these big metaphysical systems to give us the illusion that we've mastered the chaos of life. That's the active denial.
And the second stage?
The second stage is what he calls completed nihilism. This is when the whole thing eats itself. The values we use to devalue life, God, truth, objective morality, are eventually exposed as lies, human inventions.
The house of cards collapses.
The whole thing comes down.
Yeah.
And what's left is this profound world weariness, a sense that all the big goals are exhausted. This is where you get the discovery that existence has no meaning, which leads to his famous pronouncement: God is dead. The values basically commit suicide.
So the death of God isn't some moment of liberation. It's a massive burden. And this connects to what he calls the burden of historicism. How does thinking about history, which Hegel thought would make us rational, actually lead to this profound exhaustion?
Well, historicism, the realization that everything, including our most cherished values, is just a historical construct, is a shock to the system. It basically destroys the naive immune system that lets us live our lives without constantly seeing ourselves as just a cosmic accident.
When you see everything as historical, nothing feels solid anymore.
Nothing feels solid. You're just overwhelmed by the noise of all these different times and places, and it makes you feel exhausted and small. History stops being this uplifting story of progress. It becomes bad news, what he calls a disangelic historiography. It teaches you that everything you love is temporary, contingent. But unlike Kierkegaard, who found freedom in that contingency, Nietzsche just sees it as utterly draining.
And even the huge systematic efforts to deal with this, the so-called Titanisms of the 19th century, they fail too. They just fall back into the same wariness.
Exactly. I mean, think about Hegel and Marx. Hegel's project was a Titanism, trying to claim the entire human past as the property of this absolute spirit, a grand unifying theory of everything.
And Marx
had his own Titanic claim, organizing the entire future for a self-aware humanity. These were just these immense intellectual projects, trying to wrestle meaning out of the totality of time. But Nietzsche argues that even these just collapse back into the same fatigue. The effort of trying to master the past and the future just highlights how meaningless they are at the core. For Nietzsche, historicity is just another word for depression.
So the systematic thinking of Hegel and Marx fails because it's tied to this denial of life, this civilizational fatigue. Nietzsche's response has to be a complete reversal, this Dionysian affirmation. How does he describe that?
He describes it as the absolute unconditional affirmation of the world as it is, with all its horror and beauty. The famous formula is Amor Fati, love your fate.
Which isn't just passively accepting things.
No, not at all. It's an active, radical revaluation of all values. It means moving against that cowardly instinct for mere self-preservation. It demands you affirm intensity, contradiction, chaos. You have to love the terrible parts of existence because they are completely inseparable from the magnificent parts.
And his model for this kind of being, the Übermensch, the Overman, isn't a politician or a saint. It's the artist. Why the artist?
Because the artist, specifically the tragic or Dionysian artist, is the one who has the strength to look into the abyss to see the terrible truth of existence and still create, still affirm, still say yes to it all. And this requires a kind of moderation that's a bit counterintuitive. It's not about being timid. It's about overcoming that basic violent drive for survival and learning to love the absurdity and the danger of it all. The artist creates value where there is none.
I want to connect this back to the Hegel sickness, this idea of truth being found in complex, abstract systems. Nietzsche makes this incredible claim that his ability to find the truth is, well, it's visceral, it's pre-rational.
It's an amazing passage from A.K. Homo. He's talking about his reevaluation of all values. And he says, I was the first to discover the truth in that I was the first to smell the lie as a lie. My genius is in my nostrils.
In his nostrils.
In his nostrils. It's a completely physiological claim. He's saying his ability to tell truth from falsehood isn't based on logic or reason. It's an instinct. It's almost animalistic. He's rooting his entire philosophy not in the intellect, but in the wisdom of the body.
And this instinctual genius leads him to just completely blow up the idea of objective truth that Hegel was so committed to.
Completely. He's very clear on this. Objectivity is a false concept. The idea that things have some essential nature in themselves, separate from how we see them or interpret them, is, for him, a perfectly pointless hypothesis.
So there's no stable, real world out there to describe?
No. The world is nothing but an infinity of interpretations. Interpretation is all there is. The world we think is so solid is really just a manufactured world, a human construction. Just, as he says, a thickening and rounding off of a meager sum of observations.
So if everything is just interpretation, where does that leave our conscious mind, our intellect? It sounds like it gets demoted.
Massively demoted. He says over and over that our conscious thought is just an epiphenomenon. It's a little ripple on the surface of these deep, tumultuous waters of instincts. The intellect is just a machine that interprets whatever the instincts push in front of it. Most of what drives us remains completely unknown to us.
So the intellect isn't steering the ship, it's just yelling out what it sees from the crow's nest while the storm rages. Which must mean the purpose of language has to change, too. It can't be about describing an objective reality that doesn't exist.
Its purpose becomes intensity. Real language, for Nietzsche, is found in poetry, in emotion, in singing, where it's not describing something but doing something. It's a power of seduction, a magical act that creates reality. The goal is to stir up this passionate commotion, to push language right to its absolute limit.
Okay, but that limit, that's where I get a bit stuck. He says the limit is the terrifying simplicity of screaming. A scream and a counter-scream. Isn't that just giving up on knowledge? Isn't that just another kind of performance like the Hegel professor, but instead of complex fog, it's just raw noise?
That is the provocative, critical point. And you're right to be stuck on it. He argues that yes, at its most intense, language has to break down, disarticulate itself, and reach that raw, pre-linguistic sound.
The scream.
The scream. Because if structured, grammatical, systematic language is fundamentally a lie, if its job is to tame and domesticate the terrifying reality of life, then the only honest thing left is the untranslatable sound of the scream. It's a necessary refusal of the system.
So the goal is to honestly face the void.
Yes. Zarathustra's whole journey is about the triumph of poetry, which paradoxically means the triumph of an affirmed nihilism. You accept the radical nullity of everything as the absolute precondition for creation. The artist replaces the system builder, not with a better system, but with an intense momentary scream of affirmation.
We've gone from the philosophical critique of these systems with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche to something more sociological. We're moving from the critique of life to the critique of power. And this is where Bourdieu comes in, right? He shows how this intellectual exhaustion isn't just an accident. It's a feature of the social machine.
That's a perfect transition. Bourdieu gives us the sociological tools to understand this. He argues that power isn't just about money or force. It depends fundamentally on the ability of the dominant groups to impose their cultural reproductions and symbolic systems on everyone else.
And this is where complexity stops being a philosophical problem and becomes a weapon.
It becomes a meticulously maintained weapon of power.
A weapon he calls symbolic violence. How does jargon, this complex language, become a tool for this kind of silent violence?
Symbolic violence is the ability of the powerful to make the social order, which is completely arbitrary, seem natural and inevitable. Jargon is the key. Complex academic or political language functions to maintain intellectual authority and social hierarchy.
How does it do that?
Well, if a field of knowledge or a political debate requires you to know a very specific, dense vocabulary, then anyone who wasn't educated or raised to speak that language is immediately shut out. They're excluded. And the trick is, their exclusion looks like their own fault. It looks like they just weren't smart enough to get it, rather than seeing the complexity as a fence that was built specifically to keep them out.
So the jargon isn't just difficult, it's a form of currency. You need it to play the game in certain social arenas, which he calls fields.
Exactly. The jargon is tied to specific practices and a kind of bodily know-how that only works in a specific social field. A field can be anything. Academia, politics, the art world. It's any arena where people are struggling for resources.
And the other half of that is the habitus, which is how the system keeps running almost on autopilot. Can you break down that relationship between the field and the habitus?
Sure. The habitus is the set of internalized, unconscious dispositions we acquire. It's like our cultural programming. And the habitus is basically the objective rules of the field transposed into your own subjective way of being.
Can you give an example?
Okay, think about the field of elite academia. The objective structures are things like peer-reviewed journals, specific ways of citing sources, and a very specialized vocabulary. To succeed in that field, you need a habitus, an unconscious disposition that understands that using the most abstract, complex language is the right way to play.
So if you write something in simple, clear language,
the habitus of the powerful people in that field will perceive it as simplistic, as not serious. So the jargon acts as both the secret handshake and the currency. It proves you have the right programming, and it maintains the authority of the people who made up the arbitrary rules in the first place. The exclusion is baked right into the language.
That's a perfect lead into Althusser, because he's obsessed with how these systematic languages trap us, even when we think we're trying to be free. He has this critique of what he calls theoretical humanism. What's out of that trap?
Althusser was very critical of the model that often underpins emancipatory politics, which is basically a Kantian model. This theoretical humanism says that our lack of freedom is our own fault. We just haven't used our reason correctly.
So the solution is to just try harder to be free?
Pretty much. The solution is always reappropriation, reclaiming what is supposedly our true, lost human nature. It's a very idealistic, subjective model that doesn't really know how to deal with deep structural constraints.
So the message is, the freedom is inside you, you just have to find it. But Althusser, drawing on Spinoza, says the problem is the exact opposite.
Exactly. He brings in the Spinoza's concept of imaginatio, or over-recognition. Spinoza says the problem isn't that we don't see our own freedom, it's that we see more freedom than we actually have. We have this tendency to see ourselves as the free authors of our actions, even when those actions are completely determined by structures we can't see.
So real freedom isn't about finding your inner nature.
Real freedom requires the painful step of acknowledging that what feels like our own nature is actually foreign. It means recognizing the illusion of freedom, especially when you are structurally unfree.
That is a pretty bleak diagnosis. The scary part isn't that we're in chains, it's that we think the chains are jewelry. And this denial leads straight to his concept of interpolation.
Interpolation is the process by which ideology hails us, calls out to us, and makes us into subjects. And the huge paradox of modern interpolation is that all the systems, schools, media, the law, they all hail us as free, equal, and rational individuals.
They tell us we're the sovereign masters of our own destiny.
Right. But at the exact same time, that very act of hailing us as free embeds us in systems of structural unfreedom and inequality that are necessary for the system to function. The language of universal freedom is the lie that keeps us in our particular state of subjection.
What does that contradiction do to a person? Being told you're free while you're simultaneously being constrained must create some deep psychological tension.
It creates what's sometimes called Jansenist guilt. Jansenism was this very strict, hardcore branch of Catholicism that was all about human corruption and predestination. Althusser uses it as a metaphor. The individual feels perpetually guilty, not for doing something wrong, but for obeying the chains while proclaiming their freedom.
So you feel guilty for not living up to the freedom you're told you have, even though you don't actually have it.
Precisely. You feel like you're always betraying the cause of freedom just by existing inside the system that's hailing you.
Okay, so all of these systems seem to be pointing in the same direction. The system wins, the individual is trapped. But Althusser does leave a little crack of light. He talks about a counter-friction, a source of resistance that exists before we get trapped.
This is the key distinction he makes. You have to separate the concrete individual from the subjected individual. The concrete individual exists before and outside of the ideological category they get stuffed into.
Give me an example.
Think of the biblical figure Simon, the fisherman.
Simeon?
Simeon Bar-Yonah. He's a real, material, historical guy, just trying to live his life, trying to persist in his being. That raw material drive is a spontaneous counter-friction against the smooth working of the ideological machine that wants to turn him into something else. The actual person exists before the label.
So the power of naming is where you see this tension play out. The difference between Simon the fisherman and Peter the rock he becomes.
That name, Simon Peter, is a perfect example of a hybrid personal name. It literally combines the concrete individual, Simeon Bar-Yonah, with the new, imposed, interpolated theological identity, Peter the rock. That fusion shows a tension. The person, Simeon, exists before the subject, Peter, that he's made to become. And that underlying irreducible material person is where the potential for resistance begins.
Okay, so we've established that this systematic complexity can be a philosophical trap and a tool of social power. But this brings us back to a really crucial question for today. Is all complex language just jargon?
That's the million-dollar question. Because when a text like Althusser's Reading Capital came out, it was immediately hit with that bullshit critique that it was just dense for the sake of being dense. Academic obfuscation.
So how did they defend that level of technical difficulty?
Althusser's defense was all about the problem of the nameless concept. He argued that the new technical terms he was creating weren't just for show. They were a genuine attempt to solve a real theoretical problem that Marx had, which was the problem of structural causality.
Which is what, exactly?
It's the question of how a structure like capitalism as a whole can have a causal effect on its own parts, on the people and institutions within it. Althusser said Marx was wrestling with this concept throughout his work, but he literally didn't have the word for it.
The existing philosophical language just wasn't up to the task.
It was completely inadequate. You had, on the one hand, a mechanistic model, like a clock, where the whole is just the sum of its parts. And on the other, you had an expressive model, like a symphony, where every part just expresses the essence of the whole. Neither one could explain a structure that both determines its elements and is determined by them. A cause that's everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
So the complex language wasn't a performance. It was a desperate attempt to build a tool to name something that was real, but that philosophy had no words for.
Exactly. The concept of structural causality was the invisible, visible, absent-present keystone of Marx's entire project. Althusser argued that other concepts, some even borrowed from Hegel, were being forced to do the job of this missing concept, and they were failing. So that genuine conceptual struggle is what created the difficulty in the writing.
And this same difficulty shows up in Marx's own work, which leads to the whole fetishism debate. This is a case where the complexity of the explanation seemed to get in the way of the political goal.
The debate was about how to understand commodity fetishism. Some thinkers, like Rancière, initially read it as a theory of ideological mistake. We mistakenly see the relationship between people as a relationship between things. But Althusser argued that Marx himself made this problem worse by the way he chose to structure capital. He paid the price for following a Hegelian order of exposition.
You're starting with the simplest abstraction, value. But if the goal is to be clear, why start with the most abstract thing?
Because he was following that Hegelian logical progression, building up from the simplest element. Althusser's point was that this choice of ordering makes the real social relationships seem way more complicated than they need to be. It throws the reader into this conceptual maze that actually makes it easier to get confused about things and relations, the very illusion he's trying to expose.
So the difficulty isn't just in the ideas themselves, but in the very structure of the argument, a structure inherited from Hegel, the very system he was trying to break away from.
Exactly. It's a linguistic and structural trap.
So we have a huge problem. Even the most powerful critiques of the system seem to fall into these linguistic traps. If the language of the state and the language of the academy are both failing us, where do we look for what Althusser called an other practice of politics?
He really urged people to search for these non-state, non-bourgeois alternatives. He called them interstices, these local, non-centralized pockets of resistance that could build a different kind of politics from the ground up based on material practice, not abstract theory.
And a real-world example of this kind of interstice might be the Zapatista movement, the EZLN in Chiapas, Mexico, especially because their entire politics is defined by a radical rejection of the very idea of power.
That refusal is total, and it's linguistic. The Zapatistas explicitly refuse the seizure of power with a capital P. They see it as fundamentally incompatible with real democracy. For them, power means domination, hierarchy, and, most importantly, an inability to listen.
So what's the alternative?
Their practice is all about communitarian, participatory democracy. Their leaders famously govern by obeying. The goal is to convince, not to conquer. And you see it in their language. They always say the word we stands out over the word I. It's a total reversal of the individualistic subject.
And this political rejection of power seems to come from a completely different philosophical and linguistic place than the entire Western tradition we've been talking about.
It's profoundly non-Western. It's biocentric. And it's rooted in their indigenous language structures, which have this radical difference. They contain only subjects and no objects at all.
Wait, only subjects, no objects. How does that work?
It's not a metaphor. It's a deep ontological belief that everything is alive. Not just people, but animals, plants, the mountains, the rivers.
Yeah.
They're all subjects. So when you speak, you are always in a relationship with another living subject. You're never just acting upon a dead, inert object.
How does a linguistic rule like that, only subjects, no objects, change their actual politics on the ground?
It leads directly to a biocentric view of nature as Mother Earth and a total rejection of the core concept of capitalism. Private property. Their slogan says it all. The land does not belong to us. We belong to it.
You can't own another subject.
You can't own a subject. If the land is alive, if it's a subject, you can't dominate it or exploit it. You have to be in a relationship of respect with it. This one linguistic feature just completely dismantles the foundation of Western ideas about domination and resource extraction.
This sounds like the perfect embodiment of what Althusser was looking for, a political reality that is materialist and aleatory. It's not driven by some grand, necessary system.
It's the ultimate expression of it. The Zapatistas realized that to build a more just society, they had to create a language where people could recognize themselves. They're actively building a history based on material reality, the land, the community, that is also radically contingent or aleatory. Their future isn't predetermined. It's being built minute by minute through democratic listening. They show us that to change the world, you first have to think differently and speak differently to even imagine a horizon that isn't based on domination.
So we've really traced this whole arc of critique. It starts with Kierkegaard just insisting on the reality of the individual person against Hegel's giant, all-consuming system.
Then you have Nietzsche demanding this raw, honest scream of life to counter the exhaustion of a civilization that has thought itself to death. And from there, we saw how this philosophical complexity gets weaponized.
Right. Bourdieu shows us how it becomes symbolic violence, and Althusser shows how it traps us in these paradoxical chains of interpolation where we're told we're free while being anything but.
And finally, we end up seeing that this fight for clarity isn't just about, writing better sentences. It's a deep political struggle. The need to create new concepts, like structural causality, can lead to dense jargon. But the need for real emancipation pushes us back towards a simple, direct language grounded in material life.
Like we see with the Zapatistas and their refusal of power, which comes directly from their language and their relationship to the world.
So this fight against the Hegel sickness is really a fight for genuine human consequence. The challenge, it seems, is to realize that true intellectual power isn't about performing complexity. It's not about building walls. It's about finding the language and the forms of practice that are actually grounded in reality and can help us transform it, one clear, honest statement at a time.